Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. St. Bonaventure was a 13th century Franciscan friar. He was also the 7th Minister General of the Order of Friars Minor, Bishop of Albano, and a cardinal. He was born Giovanni di Fidanza in the town of Bagnoregio. He began his studies at Paris in 1235 and entered the Order of Friars Minor in 1243. He held the Franciscan chair in theology at the University of Paris, then the leading centre of theological studies, and in 1257 was elected Minister General of the Franciscans. During his 17 years as Minister General, he addressed several crises within the order, such as the mendicant controversy and the Joachites. In 1273, he was created a cardinal, appointed Bishop of Albano, and charged with preparatory work for the Council of Lyon. He died during the 4th session of that council. He was canonized in 1482 and declared a Doctor of the Church in 1557. In this interview, Randall Smith discusses St. Bonaventure and how to start reading his works. Randall Smith is full professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, and his areas of research are moral theology, historical theology, sexual ethics, faith and culture, sacred architecture, and architecture and urbanism. He's the author of Aquinas, Bonaventure, and the Scholastic Culture of Medieval Paris, Preaching, Prologues, and Biblical Commentary, from Cambridge University Press, From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body, from Emmaus Road Publishing, Reading the Sermons of Thomas Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, from Emmaus Academic, and most recently, Bonaventure's Journey of the Soul into God, Context and Commentary, from Cambridge University Press. The books discussed in this episode are, first, The Journey of the Soul into God, Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, by St. Bonaventure. Second, Mystical Opuscula, by St. Bonaventure and translated by José de Vinck. Third, Simply Bonaventure, an introduction to his life, thought, and writings by Sister Ilia Delio. Fourth, Crucified Love, Bonaventure's Mysticism of the Crucified Christ, by Ilia Delio. And fifth, The Philosophy of St. Bonaventure, by Etienne Jusson. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode and on the web page of this article. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Randall Smith, welcome.
Hello, nice to be here.
There are plenty of books on theology and spirituality. Why should someone read St. Bonaventure instead of the latest literature, the latest fare?
Well, this is always a difficult question in a way, because I write stuff, contemporarily, and so it's hard for me to say, hey, don't read contemporary stuff. So, for example, I write pretty much every other week in the Catholic thing, and I think there's lots of good stuff there. So I don't want to say don't read stuff. And there's so many very, very good things that are coming out. And I was just reading a little selection today from Thomas Joseph White's book on the Incarnation that shows up on Church Life Journal. And there was another wonderful thing there by Brant Pitre on Christology. So there's wonderful, wonderful things, right? So you don't want to say, but there are tremendous things also in the ancient world or the medieval world that we don't want to miss. And Bonaventure's Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, the journey of the mind into God, or the journey of the soul into God. It's translated slightly differently by different authors. So you'll see both possibilities, right? Depending. But anyway, it's the itinerarium, we say like the itinerary, this sort of mapping out this journey of the mind into God. And it's been a mystical sort of mastery, a masterpiece, we might say, for generations and generations. So, again, when you have a book, whether it's in theology or literature, when you have Hamlet or King Lear in literature, for example, or Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and it's been a classic. It's inspired people for generations and generations, like Augustine's Confessions has for 1,000 years. Then you start to think, well, maybe there's something to this, right? Does it make sense? And so Bonaventure, his journey of the mind into God has been one of the most popular of his books and one of the classics of what's sometimes called Western mysticism for centuries. And so, in fact, when Bernard McGinn, a famous University of Chicago theologian, put together his classics of Western mysticism, one of the major works he includes is Bonaventure's Itinerarium, The Journey of the Mind into God. So there's long been a classic for anybody who's interested in Western spirituality, Western mysticism, the ascent of the soul into God. It's been a classic for centuries.
At Paris, Bonaventure probably studied under a brilliant group of early Franciscan theologians such as Alexander of Hales, Jean de la Rochelle, Baudrigaud, and William of Middleton. Moreover, many of his writings regard the Franciscan order and his spirituality. Are there distinctive Franciscan characteristics of his theology?
Yeah. Bonaventure, of course, is fascinating as in general and in terms of his relationship with the Franciscans. It can be actually a bit controversial because some people, even at the time and ever since, have thought that Bonaventure led the Franciscans in a bad direction. Namely, instead of the sort of simple piety of St. Francis, he got them involved in academic pursuits, and moved the headquarters of the Franciscans to Paris. And of course, he was a great scholar. He had been a master of theology at the University of Paris. I argue against the notion that he's a bad Franciscan, but that, of course, in some ways is for Franciscans to determine. I actually think he's got a deep appreciation of the Franciscan spirit. But yeah, there are distinctive, let me give you a general answer and then we could maybe pick up particular things. He is certainly deeply Franciscan in his spirit and his approach, I would argue. There are particular characteristics that come from being a Franciscan, which we can get to in a minute. But there's so much at the University of Paris, so many characteristics that are shared. I mean, there's such a lively intellectual environment there that there's so many more things which are shared among all these masters than there are, big differences. I mean, in the modern world, understandably, in the academic world, we like to make a big deal about, where they differ. I like to look at all those ways in which they're so deeply similar, and there's a deep convergence, and their concern for humility, their concern for the fact that all learning, again, you'll find this in Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure both, all learning begins in humility, and all learning, great university learning, should lead ultimately to knowledge and love of God. So anyway, I always want to sort of start there and talk about those deep similarities. Then there are, again, there's differences because even in the modern world, right, people read different texts, and somebody that's very important for Bonaventure, for example, is not only Alexander of Hales and John de la Rochelle. They're also actually important, very important for Aquinas, by the way. But also the Victorines, Hugh of St. Victor, Richard of St. Victor, I think are more present and more important for Bonaventure than they are for Aquinas. Just as one example, John Damascene, for example, is somebody who shows up as very important in the work of Aquinas, who doesn't show up hardly at all, if at all, in the work of Bonaventure. So yeah, look, different people read different books. Different people have, are inspired by different things in different ways. But that's what makes it interesting, right? Bonaventure had 14 years of training at the University of Paris. So he has a tremendously high literary sort of sensibility. His preaching is at a very high level. Thomas, on the other hand, spent his time at the University of Naples and studying logic. So he just doesn't have the same sort of high literary kind of characteristics that Bonaventure got at Paris, but he's a tremendous logician, right? And he has that tremendous training. And then with Albert, he studied natural philosophy, what we would call sort of the natural sciences, and the works of Aristotle a lot more than Bonaventure did. But Bonaventure shows that he's very, very knowledgeable, actually, about the works of Aristotle. So you don't want to, if you've ever read his Christ the One Teacher sermon that he gave, which was translated by Zachary Hayes, it's a wonderful text. He shows, oh, no, I know my Aristotle, right? I mean, he's done his training, actually. So again, there are differences, but deep similarities.
The mendicant controversy was one of the challenges that St. Bonaventure had to address as Minister General. What was the controversy about, and how did he deal with it?
Well, both Bonaventure and Aquinas, but I mean, we might say both the Dominicans and the Franciscans, had to deal with this issue of mendicant life. Namely, it's controversial in a number of ways for at the University of Paris. One would be to say, should these mendicants, again, let me back up one step. There was a debate within the mendicants, at least within the Franciscans, whether they should be professors at a place like the University of Paris. But then there were secular clergy, lay clergy, secular, maybe not exactly the right way of referring to them, but, ones that are not related to particularly religious orders, and other faculty at the University of Paris that opposed them being part of the faculty at the University of Paris. Part of that had to do with the fact that when they went on strike early on, before Thomas and Bonaventure actually were incepted as masters, earlier, William of Middleton, for example, and the Franciscans, they refused to go on strike with the lay faculty members. So they were sort of disliked for that reason, unfortunately. Anyway, and so that's why actually the inception of Bonaventure and Thomas were held up for a number of years, and the Pope had to intervene to actually get them to be incepted as masters at the University of Paris. I'm sorry, not the University of Theology. Well, it was the university where theology was done, but largely, which, all good to Oxford and Cambridge, which came a little bit later in terms of preeminence. But in any case, the problem is the issue of, in some ways, should begging friars, there was a question of people who get their living, as it were, begging. Is that a noble thing to do, or does it merely steal money from people who are more needy? And again, is it appropriate to them for their vocation to be masters at a place like at a university? And sometimes you see that same sort of thing going on today. I don't see it so often with Dominicans, but I do see it with Franciscans. People are like, why are these Franciscans here? Shouldn't they be out, taking care of horses and petting donkeys and, I don't know, something out in nature, whatever. And today as well, you have people who are like, wait a minute, they're begging, they don't own anything, but people give them things. And so, you see Franciscans or Dominicans driving a car and you say, where did they get that car? And the point is, like, somebody donated it to them. And it's like, well, that's a pretty nice car. Anyway, so it's always been a bit controversial, this issue about, like, sort of, you don't own anything, but people donate things to you, but you don't look as poor as, people who are homeless, who are under the, bridge. So it's not exactly the same vocation as, say, Mother Teresa's of Calcutta's sisters have, where they really do, live without anything. But it's a different vocation.
Bonaventure was appointed Minister General to succeed John of Parma, who'd been made to step down because he looked favourably upon the millenarianism of Joachim of Fiore. Why were a significant number of Franciscans Joachimites?
Yeah, that's a very good historical question. And for people who don't know, Joachim of Fiore was this monk who, this comes up every now and again, right? He saw history, or let's say he saw the Trinity as a kind of historical development, right? There would be the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and then the age of the Holy Spirit's particular activity in the world. And sometimes there's a separationism. So I don't want to go into Joachim right at the moment. In any case, the bottom line was, who somehow embraces this and fully embodies this new final age that would embody Christ. Well, the Joachimites and the Franciscans said, well, it's Francis, right? So it's not only that Francis is a great guy, Francis is a saint, Francis is our founder, but Francis now is somehow definitive in the church in a certain way, right? As though somebody had said, and in the fullness of time, God chose Francis, to be the model, the embodiment of this new age. Well, you can see why this would be particularly a happy idea for Franciscans, okay, to sort of suggest that their man is this important. A lot of times in the church, there can be legitimate, wonderful spiritual renewal movements that have their place. The question is whether somehow they should be definitive or everyone should live that way or be that way. Whereas the tradition in the church has always been, there are Franciscans and there are Dominicans and there are Benedictines who have a very different life. People, again, sometimes don't understand that Benedictines take not only a vow of chastity and obedience and poverty, right, of a certain sort, but they also take a vow of stability. So they stay in their monastery, whereas Franciscans and Dominicans have always been able to travel around. That's been one of their abilities to go from university to university or do training in various and sundry places. So they're kind of wandering monks. So anyway, those are very different spiritualities. And again, we have the rosary, very, very valuable and important thing. But among the Benedictines, they sometimes do the rosary, but they have the office, the liturgy of readings that they do. They chant. The original Benedictine idea was to chant all 150 Psalms every week. So anyway, that the Joachimite tendency was kind of again popular among the Franciscans, but made them, shall we say, a little less popular among some of the other religious orders who are like, well, we like Francis, but is that really everything? I'm simplifying, obviously, and the church officials who also thought Francis was great, but the Joachimite tendency, again, if you want to separate the Trinity in that way, this kind of what in the modern world we would call process theology was also considered to be and is heretical. So Joachim was generally considered to be a heretic, and thus to embrace a heretical movement was not the thing that would make you most popular in the church for a number of reasons.
The works by St. Bonaventure, before we go on to that, what drew you to study the writings of St. Bonaventure?
Well, again, Thomas and Bonaventure are sometimes called the Due Lumines, right? The two great lights of the Middle Ages. So if you want, as I am, been interested in, the theology, I've actually been interested in the theology of the church in general, but my areas of special interest have always been, ancient philosophy of the Greeks, but then patristic and medieval. But one of the things I liked about, and the reason I went to the Medieval Institute at Notre Dame, is I'd always admired classicists. I know this is a strange way of saying it, but classicists seem to know something about a whole world. And I always admired the fact that when I was an undergraduate and you had a classics professor, people could come to them and talk to them about, literature, like tell me about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and tell me about Plato, and tell me about Sophocles, and tell me about this history of something. Tell me about what was happening in Athens. I found that really fascinating, that people would know about a whole kind of world and a culture. And so when I went off to study patristics and medieval stuff, I wasn't just interested, although I was primarily interested in, say, Augustine and Aquinas and Aristotle, but I was interested in the whole world, the intellectual world of the Middle Ages, and Bonaventure is a very, very important and interesting part of that, and he's quite brilliant, right? So it's hard if you study the 12th century, for example, Bonaventure's 13th century. If you study the 12th century, you'll almost undoubtedly get to Hugh and Richard of St. Victor, because they're just unbelievably brilliant and amazing sort of characters and figures. If you study the 13th century, you're going to study undoubtedly Thomas Aquinas, but you're almost undoubtedly also going to study Bonaventure, because he's just amazing. Sometimes people don't do both. In fact, in the book that I had sent to published on Cambridge University Press on the prologues, it's called Aquinas, Bonaventure, and the Medieval Scholastic, the scholastic culture of medieval Paris. Don't know the title of my own book. One of the reviewers was kind of shocked that I liked both Aquinas and Bonaventure, because the tendency is to kind of like, if you like Aquinas, then you're like, well, Bonaventure's kind of second rate. And if you like Bonaventure, like, well, yeah, but I'm not, Aquinas was kind of logician, whatever. I'm a big fan of both.
The works by St. Bonaventure that you've selected for new readers belong to his writings on the spiritual life. However, he also wrote major works of a more academic and systematic character. Presumably, you've not recommended them because they're more challenging and suppose some training in theology. Which of these works are the most important ones?
Well, when you were talking to me about coming here, I was thinking about books that, would be more accessible to general readers, and also things that might be sort of related to the journey of the mind into God, or the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, right? So I mentioned or listed a series of translations of that work. There have been several very good translations of that work, and several, a number of them have good notes in the back. One of the very best, actually, I didn't mention the translation, is called Into God, Bonaventure's Itinerarium. And the author of the translator his name is escaping me right at the moment, but it's got tremendous notes. It's as full as you could possibly want. It's come through Catholic University of America Press. But one of the beauties of some of the other volumes I suggest is they have other works of Bonaventure in them, and they're all wonderful too. So if you get a chance to read The Tree of Life, for example, by Bonaventure, it's tremendous as well. A lot of the works of Bonaventure are tremendous. His Reduction of the Arts to Theology was his inception address as a master of Paris. It's dense but brilliant. And fascinating, but it takes a little more, sort of getting used to. The Tree of Life is a little more accessible, I think, with a beautiful image based on this idea that there's a tree with 12 branches and fruits and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Bonaventure is very wonderful about the use of imagery. Anyway, so the books I recommended had to do with that. There are, of course, also wonderful books. Lots of people have written about Bonaventure. Again, he's in some ways not as well known for popular audience, maybe as Thomas Aquinas' name, but they're tremendous. One of the ones I recommended, which has been reprinted, which is nice, is Etienne Gilson's The Philosophy of St. Bonaventure, which is now back out in press. It was originally a major publisher, Random House or somebody, but it's been out of print for a little bit. But now it's been republished by Cluny Media, and it's a wonderful volume. I also recommended, as part of that, for people who want a shorter thing, I recommended a wonderful actual internet resource in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is on line. an article by my colleague, Ed Hauser, and his friend from CUA, Tim Noon. They did this wonderful sort of philosophical article, an introduction to Thomas Aquinas. I mean, not to Thomas Aquinas, to Bonaventure. And I recommend that one very highly, just because it's short and it's very readable and it really gets you into it pretty quickly, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing you can do in an hour, a couple hours in an afternoon and get yourself nicely oriented in the thought of Bonaventure.
Would you also recommend his Breviloquium, a sort of short summary of theology?
Yeah. No, and for those who are interested, you were talking to me about philosophy and the philosophy of Bonaventure, but in terms of works of Bonaventure, thank you for reminding me. I mean, this is really important. The Breviloquium is called that, right, because it was meant to be a kind of brief introduction to the basics of theology. And it's a beautiful work and short and, again, basic. Now, here's the thing. It gives you a sense of the genius of Bonaventure in the way that if you study Aquinas, if I were doing a theology of Aquinas course, depending, right, I might have my students read, for example, Aquinas's sort of sermon conferences, as it were. They're called collationes, on the 10 Commandments and the 2 great commandments to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's very readable, very well. People don't tend to do that because they want the more academic Aquinas, right? Like those are texts that are very, his Aquinas's sermon conferences on the Creed or on the Hail Mary, very, very approachable. But people tend to like, well, but I need to know something about Aquinas so I can go to graduate school and study Aquinas or something, right? And so they tend to do the more, academic sorts of things that you find in the Summa or his commentaries on Aristotle, all of which are tremendous. But in Bonaventure, similarly, if you read the Breviloquium, he is not trying to be like Franciscan, deeply philosophical. He's really trying to lay out the basics of the faith. And that's what makes it very beautiful and very elegant. I mean, it is very Bonaventurian in its simplicity and its beauty and its elegance. It's just not, as we might say, filled with all that kind of philosophy that makes modern people in the academy interested in, doing that kind of thing. But no, I could recommend the Breviloquium very highly.
As you mentioned, St. Bonaventure was a very distinguished, one of the 3 main theologians of the 13th century. But the school of theology that most Franciscans followed was that of Blessed John Scotus. St. Bonaventure did not gain as wide a following among the Franciscans as St. Thomas Aquinas did among the Dominicans.
Well, again, there's a question you'd have to ask a Franciscan in a way. But I will say, look, Scotus, I'm not as much a fan of Scotus as some Franciscans I've met who love Scotus, right? And it's just never been my taste. There are things which are, of course, brilliant in Scotus. But look, here's one thing I guess I would say about that, or 2. First, let me say something about Bonaventure. Namely, the Franciscans have been devoted to Bonaventure. There's a lot of material that has come out of the St. Bonaventure University, for example, the works of St. Bonaventure. Unlike the Dominicans, by the way, whom I love and whatever, they were given the commission by Pope Leo to get all the works of Thomas out in modern editions. Well, the Franciscans were able to do this with the works of Bonaventure before we got very far into the 20th century. So all the works of Bonaventure are actually, in a modern critical edition, not one that was done in the last 20 years, but, they've done great work actually in translating Bonaventure and getting modern critical editions of Bonaventure out. So they have been actually devoted to Bonaventure. But you're right. Scotus is a very imposing and important figure. And part of the reason for that is, I think, again, you'd really have to talk to Franciscan, is it's important to understand that Bonaventure actually, he was incepted as a master. But then even almost before he began teaching, he was made Master General of the Franciscan Order. So he went off in a very different direction. And so his works are brilliant and deeply theological, but they're not academic in the same way that Scotus's were. Does that make sense? Like Scotus is a real university guy, okay? And if you're a university guy in the modern world and you want to compare things in Thomas's Summa with things going on in the Franciscan intellectual world, you're probably going to go to Scotus rather than Bonaventure, because Scotus has got the same kind of scholastic approach. Now, there's developments, obviously, in the meantime. I don't mean to say they're the same, but I just think, and look, even with Thomas, I've oftentimes, and in my works, I've sort of said, look, why aren't people as interested in Thomas's sermons or his biblical commentary as they are in, say, his Aristotelian commentaries? And I think everything's worth being interested in Aquinas. But part of the reason is that, when in the Thomistic revival of the late 19th century, under Leo XIII and, even before him, but whatever, people were interested in resurrecting people like Aquinas for their philosophical arguments to oppose a kind of Enlightenment rationality and rationalism, which was sweeping the world, German idealism, et cetera, et cetera. So they were interested in them as a resource for philosophical arguments primarily. And in which case, again, you would probably then go to Scotus rather than Bonaventure, because Bonaventure is, again, become less of a university guy. You're more likely to go, for example, to Thomas and Scotus than you would be, for example, to Bernard of Clairvaux, who's got brilliant, beautiful sermons, but, arguments. And so people in philosophy tend to look at Anselm's ontological argument rather than other things that are less philosophical, we might say, but also more deeply profound in the works of these 12th century authors.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.